Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the meeting of the Review of Standing Orders Subcommittee. Just to let you know that please note that this meeting may be recorded and subsequently made available to the public for listening purposes. We do have 2 apologies today.
Thank you, Chair. I can confirm we've got 5 members present, 2 apologies being Councillor Carruthers and Councillor Hislop.
Do we have any declarations of interest today? Thank you. We have the minutes of the meeting of the 1st of September 2017 to note. Thank you. Just moving on to the first item then. The purpose of this report is to request members to agree to a review of the administration of common good funds by the Council. And we're being asked to agree to review the arrangements for the administration of common good funds given recent legislative changes and to receive a report on options to the next meeting of this subcommittee for recommendations to the full Council if appropriate. I'll just pass you on to Rona.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. The common good over the last few years, I think this council's done a tremendous job, and particularly thanks to elected members, about restoring the place of the common good in our property portfolio. It has, however, been brought to my attention by a number of members over the last couple of years that we do have some inequality in the arrangements that we have, and that's primarily been down to the fact that some common good funds had a lot of cash to give out in grants, etc., and others simply had property. Those with property, we haven't even had a register of those properties until recently for some of them. The property aspect, though, is becoming a lot more important with community asset transfers and with the council reviewing its own property portfolio and what can be changed. We've also seen some developments in common good, positive developments in legislation that we're now allowed to use common good property for a different purpose than what it was first bought for, and that's been allowed through a process where we can now go to the sheriff and ask for permission, which means that we have seen the benefit of common good property being used for really wider community purposes than we ever envisaged. And we also have the power now to go to the sheriff and ask for him to grant permission to sell common good property, which, if it were in the category of being inalienable, as they called it in the past, we would never have been allowed to do that. So I think it's quite important that we look at what mechanisms we're going to use and what structure we're going to have for common good discussions going forward. So I would see this review as very much being member-led, that we would be coming round the political groups and asking for your ideas and your approach to see how we can improve the administration of common good going forward.
Thanks, Rona. Members. Stephen.
Thanks, Chair. Welcome the review. I think there's a couple of things just within the report that I was wanting to raise, if not just to highlight, really. But obviously, one of the things has been the lack of consistency about how common good funds are dealt with, even in terms of whether or not to establish them. Obviously, Sanker's mentioned there as one that does have funds to disperse, but there's no subcommittee, and I'm sure there's members in Upper Nithsdale have flagged that before. So I think there should be an element of consistency, especially where there's funds to disperse. However, I know that Annandale and Estill Area Committee, for example, have chosen not to establish the likes of Moffat and Langham, and I know there was, as Rona was outlining, there was common good asset in Canonby, which these sort of things would come up very rarely, but when they do, I think that it's appropriate to have a mechanism for dealing with them. But I think the area committee model is sometimes maybe actually appropriate rather than having a plethora of subcommittees that have to be stood up and attended to, because then you've got issues to do with quorum and an extra meeting in the calendar or two. But I think it would be important to maybe get establish what the assets are, which I think we're in the process of doing, and we do publish that on the council website. But then maybe for each common good, maybe just have, if it's not a sitting committee that disperses funds, maybe have at least an annual noting of what the assets are, perhaps at area committee, and then that way we can at least have an oversight of it, although it may be a very passive oversight because the common good assets aren't really, there's nothing happening to them, as it were. So I don't know if that's sort of worth taking on board. The other thing I just wanted to add was that Dumfries Common Good, I noticed that we seem to think that elected members' wards, any common good borough within that ward would entitle the member to be in the common good. But I remember a few years ago, I think it was Councillor McCautry and Councillor Witts maybe at the time, used to sort of challenge this idea about having to live in the borough to be on the common good. So that seems to be an inconsistency in terms of what the report presents at 3.4. So it was really just to highlight that, and obviously that's another element of consistency maybe we have to look at. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rowland.
Yeah, no, I think these are extremely valid points, if I can just do them in the reverse order. It was the position in the last council that the members took the decision that you had to live in the former borough of Dumfries to be on the committee, but that was reversed this administration, and now it's everyone whose ward is in the former Royal Borough who can sit on the Common Good subcommittee, which I think is a good decision going forward, that it should be about those that people represent, not where a particular member lives. I'm not aware of any of that being an issue at other common goods, but I'm sure we'll find that out as we do the review, and I think it's worth thinking about.
Sorry, just on that one, but the last Dumfries Common Good was within this council cycle, and I don't think, as I noticed from the apologies and the attendees, I don't think it included all the members of the Dumfries ward. So I'm just wondering if that's about to happen, or if we can double check that one.
It was certainly supposed to be that, and that was what was agreed at the start of last May. So we can check that is happening.
I'm pretty certain that is what happened. That it did include everybody.
I'm convinced there's at least one Nith ward member who hadn't had an invite and didn't, but it's maybe just worth double checking. Thanks.
In terms of the annual noting of assets, I think that is something that we should be doing going forward. I mean, some of the boroughs have not been given a close look at. I would flag up Dalbeattie, for instance, which was a former police borough, and it's only through certain individual transactions that we become aware of the existence of common good. And I think there's a lot of people, some of them sit on community councils and some are just interested members of the community who can actually feed in a lot of information. I know that's particularly the case in Dalbeattie, where one of our librarians sits on the community council and she's passed on lots of information about potential common good property in Dalbeattie that we'll work our way through. We'll certainly take up those ideas for the review.
Thank you, Richard, and then David.
Thanks, Chair. I think Councillor Thompson's rehearsed some of the things which will be discussed during the review. I think it's important we have a review to make sure there's consistency, but and the same governing guidelines for all the common good funds. Obviously, one size doesn't obviously need the consistency in that way, but in other ways, one size doesn't fit all, because some common goods need more time apportioned to them to make sure they're run and governed properly. Thanks.
David.
Thank you, Chair. Rona was saying we also have the power to go to the sheriff to sell assets. May I ask who is we in that? Would that be the Common Good Fund, or is it the council, or who? And the second question I have here is, what sorts of property, just for my own interest, what sort of property do common goods own which are not generating any funds? You know, because you mentioned there were those who had assets but no income, and I would have thought in most cases they're probably renting their properties out, wouldn't they? Or maybe there are just types of building I hadn't thought of. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the procedure is that the council petitions the sheriff to release land from the common good. So that's generally done. Legal services will prepare that. It always goes through the appropriate common good subcommittee or area committee, and then usually Policy and Resources Committee before that's actioned. So an example of one that we did recently was for the bridge out at Cuckoo Bridge site, and it used to be, we were calling it the hub, I'm sure we're calling it the bridge now, for education. So we had to get that land released from the common good to be able to set up the community trust. And another one was the one that Councillor Thompson mentioned in Canonby, where Scottish Water wanted a piece of our common good land to build a new pumping station. So that's with the sheriff just now to decide on that one. So it's quite a good process that wasn't open to us before, because there was a very famous case in Edinburgh, in Portobello, where Edinburgh City Council wanted to build a new secondary school in Portobello on some playing fields, I think down by the waterside, and that was something that was demonstrated against by the public because they wanted to keep the lands. They went to the court, but the court had no power in those days to grant them the permission to use the land to build a school, and it actually needed a act of the Scottish Parliament to actually be allowed to do that. So thankfully, things have modernised a little bit in the last couple of years. We've got those powers. The types of property that common good own are varied. You know, it could be playing fields, it could be public buildings, and some of those do not therefore have any rental income because they're just for community use. Or, for instance, in Dumfries, the municipal chambers are common good property, but the council actually uses them for its own offices, and there's not a financial transaction goes back and forward. The council looks after them, it repairs them, not the common good. Therefore, it's not appropriate that no rent changes hands because the council's got technically the liability there. There's lots of variations to that, in that some properties are rented out and the common good gets income. Some common goods have fishing rights, which used to be quite lucrative in the days before catch and release. Primarily Dumfries and Annan have those fishing rights. Some common good property might even be paintings and clocks and ceremonial chains. There's a lot of things like that around as well.
Thank you. So just to understand the sheriff being involved, is that in a case where the common good committee doesn't want to sell the land? Can that be processed against the will of the administrating committee?
No, we would always need the council to agree that it did want to try and sell the land or transfer it or use it for a different purpose. So it's when we want to do something different with it or sell it, we approach the sheriff to give approval, and then that allows the public an opportunity to object to that because it's advertised in the newspapers, etc.
All right, so I'm completely ignorant then, because I thought perhaps these were assets that originally were part of common good borough type situations that weren't, in a sense, owned by the council. But you're saying they're fundamentally council assets, all these assets, right? Is that?
Yeah, they were assets that over the centuries had been, sometimes given for the benefit, usually a local, aristocrat or duke had given. Here we've got a lot of the Duke of Buccleuch gifted to different people or different communities over time, and they were considered to be land that nobody else could touch. They had to be there for sort of common, for exercise or for washing and things like that. And then they came at the late 19th century, they came into council gifts, and the council started to take care of them. So it's everything that at 1975 was the property of the former boroughs was transferred to the councils, kept those, but they had to keep them separate in terms of accounting and show them as being common good.
Thank you. And on the second point about the types of property, are all these arrangements actually allowed? Grace and favour, and one hears from it's not really ideal for tax situations if one body is using something without paying for it but does something else in return. Are they all as you would wish them to be?
It's a very complex and mixed picture. I think in terms of the council, the common good property is owned by the council. So I think, the council looks after it, and the sort of payback is that sometimes we will use that for our own purposes, but given we are a body that's here to serve the public, arguably the common good, then I don't think that's inappropriate. But we have had, quite a mix of arrangements across Dumfries and Galloway. It tends to be that if it's an external body, they will pay some sort of rent, albeit usually a discounted rent, given that it's common good. And often the organisations are, for instance, the Lord Burn Hall offices are rented to the Girl Guiding Association. So it's usually that sort of organisation that we would encourage to use the offices that we have.
Thank you. Richard.
Thanks, Chair, again. Right, the report mentions community empowerment there, and be nothing greater for the good of the community and empowerment if local people could be on these committees and actually have votes and have some sort of local power. Can that be considered, or is it completely illegal to do that?
There have been a number of times that we've come to full council. I think maybe at least two that I remember, where we've asked for the community councillors that sit on the common good subcommittees to be given voting rights. Each time the council has decided not to extend voting rights to community councillors who sit on the common good, but it's certainly something that we can, if you're so minded, put in the review again if you wish to consider that.
Yeah, I think it would be good to at least consider it again.
Thank you. Stephen.
Thanks again, Chair. Just a couple of points, but in 3.5 that it mentions, obviously there's been a collection of views just around common goods, etc. I wasn't aware of any particularly noisy views about the conjoined committees. I mean, I think there's an appropriateness in terms of ward councillors. Often common good boroughs would be within a ward, and apart from maybe Dumfries, but it would make sense in terms of time and officer time, and even just having one meeting where a conjoined meeting you can deal with the business of both separately, but there's a case to have that, so I wasn't aware there was. Can I maybe express a view that actually it's good to have conjoined committees, just to balance that out a bit? Also, in 3.9, it does touch on things to do with the funds, as well as sort of the asset transfer process, etc. And I'm aware that there was a piece of work carried out, a sort of ongoing piece of work to do with rationalisation of trusts, including common goods. And I'm just conscious that there'll be some common goods with assets where the financial management of the assets in terms of how they're invested or not invested, or decisions taken around what to do with that money to generate income, if you like, for disbursement. Is that a piece of ongoing work as we look to rationalise trusts and common goods? And just touching on something you raised earlier about the municipal buildings in Dumfries. It would be quite common, I think, from experience of common good subcommittees, where if we're renting out a piece of ground, for example, we would look at the market value of that land if it wasn't being used for another purpose. In terms of, I'm thinking of Lockerbie Golf Club. So there's a market value put on the land. Similarly, I'd imagine there'd be a notional value for properties where we use, such as municipal chambers or Lochmaben Town Hall, I think, or there's a few others where it would be helpful if it's an asset within our control that we understand what the value of that asset is, because under the community asset transfer process, another community group might say, well, actually, we can do more with that building and deliver more out of it. Obviously, it would be unusual because we're the local authority, but there may be cases where understanding the rental cost of that building and how it would show up in our books would give us a better understanding of what actually in-kind benefit we're doing in terms of maintenance and what the value of that is. So I think there's a point there that Councillor James had highlighted that I think maybe it would be better to clarify what that value is for our information as well as for the public's information and any community group that might seek to acquire that building under the community empowerment legislation.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the values that go on our accounts, but I know every piece of council property, whether it's ours or common good, will have a value, though I'm not absolutely sure that's market value. We tend to get the market value assessed at the point that somebody wants to have it transferred. The accounting value that goes in our books, I think, is a different value. If I've been following the debates at P&R on that matter, but it's certainly something we can look at. Yeah,
so to cut in, it's more just in terms of internal recharge income, so the likes of property and architectural, corporate services, or however that's divvied up within the activity-based budget book, for example, which shows internal recharges for property and maintenance, etc. I don't know where you're saying that in a way we need to keep, we are in charge of common goods, but we need to account for them separately. But I don't see that separation in, for example, the activity-based budget. So if we are going to do it in terms of having a subcommittee to deal with the assets and the incomes, I think we should also account for that separately as well in our books, because it would be consistent, I feel. But I don't know if that maybe needs a bit more exploration.
There is a requirement in our accounts that all common good property funds are accounted for separately. So that's already done, that the finance officers do that. But say we haven't gone into the realms of, recharging, between the notional council and the common good for using and for repairing. All the property in that sense is treated pretty much as one, although the common good properties are shown separately in the accounts and should be, as well as the funds. They should be listed separately. But probably the best thing is I can provide examples of that around the groups, and you can see how that works.
Just even on that, I wouldn't know how to demonstrate we were getting best value if we don't know what the rent of the building, what the notional cost of the building would be, or are we getting it for a song and another? There's no quantum to that, so it's hard to sort of know what good value is.
I think that just given that we don't have extensive resources to work on it, I think the best way, in my opinion, to approach it would be when we get a request from a group to use a building in the same way as we did with the Lower Burn offices. I mean, there was public opinion that other groups wanted to use those offices, and it shouldn't just be the council, and that's what triggered in those days it was Alec Haswell to do a review of that property to say, well, actually, we can make that available to community groups, and the council will come out of it. And we only took some of it back when we had to find some accommodation when DG1 closed. But essentially, that property was given back to the community for them to use and to pay. It was pretty much a peppercorn rent, but they were to make office space and meeting space available for other community groups, which was a good idea. But I think that work might be more. I think it would be a better use of resources if we targeted the work when we knew there was somebody interested, rather than we did it for every common good building.
Or if we had to move out of a building that happened to be common good for a temporary purpose to get it refurbished, there would be probably a rental charge to the building that we moved into. So actually, using the common good building might be effectively a saving on something that we would otherwise have to pay a certain amount of rent for example. So I'm just thinking there'd be situations where it might not be a community group, but an actual move because of refurbishment or something else on the horizon. So maybe just a thought to chuck in there.
Thank you. Tommy, did you want to?
Very briefly, Chair. It was just to pick up on the point that was made about the members of the public or community councils sitting on common goods. I mean, one of the things I've managed to retain being a councillor is I'm still a member of the public. So I think we can fulfil that role further. I mean, if people elect us, we should carry out their decisions for them, no bring in more people to do it.
Thank you. Any more points? So I wonder if we could move to the recommendations then. Do we agree to review the arrangements for the administration of common good funds given recent legislative changes, and to receive a report on options to the next meeting of this subcommittee for recommendations to full council if appropriate? Agreed. Thank you. Now to the amendment of scheme of administration and delegation to committees. The purpose of this report is to ask members to consider an amendment to the scheme of administration and delegation to committees. Members? David.
Thank you, Ross. I had hoped to get through a full year of being a councillor without being reported to the Standards Commission, but through the usual channels the other day, I heard that I might not have reached that milestone. So looking at the content here, I'm not sure if it's appropriate for me to be in this part of the meeting, but take guidance on that, please.
It's just a procedural matter, not about any particular member in particular, so don't see an issue.
Tommy, yeah. Richard?
Yeah, quite happy with the report.
Stephen?
Yeah, just a minor point here. I think it was just obviously there's a bit of a cut and a paste in terms of what should be in the delegation for policy and resources and what should come back to full council in terms of the findings or the recommendations from the Standards Commission in respect of any breach. But I'm just wondering, I presume it's still the assumption that any reports and recommendations from Standards Commission on any other matter would go to policy and resources, and it would only be any recommendation in relation to an individual breach by any individual member. I was just a bit confused about things to do with findings and recommendations, which might be a general finding that's a recommendation, so that'd be policy and resources, whereas only breaches would go to full council. Is that a correct understanding?
Nick?
Yes, Chair, that's right. It's the legislation actually requires that reports from Standards Commission hearing panels should be considered only by full council, and this is what the change is directed at, nothing else.
Members, can we then move to the recommendation that we are asked to consider the proposed amendment to the scheme of administration and delegation to committees as detailed in paragraphs 3.2 to 3.4, and that will be reported to full council. Thank you very much. As there is no further business, I bring this meeting to a close. Thank you for coming.